So there you go. Stage is yours.
Yeah, I did a Viva a couple of months ago, and was supposed to. It was online for obvious reasons. Of course, that's one of the benefits of COVID. You can do Vivas from across the world, but of course, it does mean you don't get to meet people. But anyway, so the point is that you're supposed to record it, and I completely forgot to hit the record button at the beginning. And of course, you can't really sort of say halfway through, but I'm going to record half the vibe because that's not much good. So there you go. So I ended up with forgetting. Okay, right. Without further ado, because I always pack a lot into these slides on the basis that they're going to be published subsequently through DocHub, and you've got a lot of information. But as I also appreciate, if people really want to know about this, you can't really do justice to any particular topic in an hour. You can only just really skirt over the sort of the substance and the sort of the basic principles as best you can. And quite clearly, we may have sort of questions and discussions which will elaborate on that. But nonetheless, what I would always encourage people to do is to go and read about the sort of the topic in the many textbooks and which are sort of dedicated to organizational ethnography, and certainly in most of the sort of the usual textbooks that you'll have come across, or the research methodology books, perhaps to be more specific, you'll find a chapter written about ethnography. So again, without further ado, as I say, I don't want to get too bogged down. So, right, okay, this is the sort of the basic principles. You'll all have read the sort of the preamble and the blurb about the basis of sort of what ethnography is meant to be and its Greek origins. But I'm going to talk about ethnography in its general sort of terms, and then more particularly why we should really sort of actively consider its use in sort of understanding and researching business organizations and businesses processes, and in summary, and perhaps this is what it boils down to, better and more deeply understanding what goes on in organizations and why, from the perspective of those people who are involved in the sort of or intimately involved in the sort of processes, the practitioners, as it were. And I suppose that kind of summarizes what the sort of the last point might be, that sort of why you should think about it, if you haven't already done so, as a sort of method of operationalizing your research and certainly adding new dimensions. Okay, so again, just to sort of go on that, we're going to sort of think about sort of the background to organizational ethnography and what it is in terms of a practical approach, which you may have come across, and if you haven't, I'm hopefully going to sort of inspire you to. So as part of that, a short history, because I think history is always really important. And indeed, just to sort of to add a little footnote there, because I'm something of a historian. I like writing about history. Indeed, I was talking to a PhD student last night who's doing sort of medieval history, and the point about history is quite often you have only the sort of the accounts that are written by those who sort of wrote up, and of course the old adage that history is written by the victors. The benefit of sort of using ethnography is that it explicitly sort of exhorts the sort of the researcher to go and talk and study and observe, and whatever words you wish to use, the people involved. So they're not treated like laboratory rats. They are positively sort of considered as people who have opinions about what they do and how they do it. So again, as part of that, I'll talk about its use, a summary of the advantages and potential issues it may raise, because of course, like everything, there are advantages and pros and cons, as it were. And just to re-emphasize, it's an interactive session. So if there's any sort of question you really want to ask at the time, well, do sort of put it into sort of the chat room. We can sort of pick it up later. And if it really is sort of burning and you need to ask the question, then please stick your hand up, or we'll find some sort of way of dealing with it. Okay, without further ado, perhaps it's always useful to sort of to give my personal perspective, because I think that's quite helpful as to why I became a real convert. Some of you may know this already, but for the sort of the sake of completeness, for those who don't, my first degree was in engineering by and large, although it was a management degree in an engineering department. My Master of Science was also in an engineering department. And then I continued doing a sort of a part-time PhD, also in a department of engineering, which created sort of difficulties. So anyway, to cut to the chase on this one, I was doing the classical sort of thing of thinking about hypothesis, which was based upon my sort of desire to study the use of quality management, which I'm sure you'll all have come across. I'm not going to bore you with the details. And what it was is it was introduced, we're talking sort of almost 30 years ago, in fact it was probably about 30 years ago. And of course it was being touted as the thing that was going to sort of change the world, and there were lots of benefits. But what it came down to was that I started having real difficulties of trying to sort of to operationalize the sort of the hypothesis, insofar as that, this thing was being introduced. There were what I described in my own PhD as the sort of the practitioner-orientated literature, which was sort of propagating this thing as it was going to be all things to all people, men, women, children, whatever. It was going to sort of produce all known sort of efficacies for organizations. And that was all fine, because they could say that without very little substance. And of course, my role, as I thought it was to sort of to prove or disprove. But the difficulty I came across, and this is the sort of the clincher, was that, well, yeah, I know. So things may be happening, but they may be happening despite and not because of. I could not create the sort of degree of causality that hypotheses normally would assume to sort of to use. And again, giving non-acknowledgement to the sort of fact I was in the civil engineering department. But my sort of supervisor, who was a sociologist, who, dare I say, it was very much a fish out of water, but teaching management, he sort of exhorted me to sort of to continue reading. And I started coming across the sort of the sociological accounts and ethnography, or certainly qualitative approaches, of which ethnography is a sort of a part, assumed a greater significance. And perhaps I'm referencing sort of, one of the really seminal influences in this regard, and you'll sort of see that on the sort of the screen, the front page of the sort of the book, which was published in 1922, so what took 100 years ago, Brian Bronislaw Malinowski, who sort of studied the sort of the Western Pacific. But just to add to that, the book that really helped me in my sort of dilemma, and helped me sort of out of my gunk hole, as it were, and sort of the difficulty I was having, was a book called In Search of Management. And if you've never come across it, I really would exhort you to sort of to get hold of a copy, indeed even buy one if you have to, by an author called Tony Watson. And his book, if I just summarize, was a study of a sort of, it was a fictitious organization, but anybody who knew anything about this sort of the Tony Watson could work out where it was, but that doesn't matter. And what he did is he used an ethnographic approach to go in and talk to people about the things that have been done to them. And in particular, to my shame, I can't remember what the subtitle, but I think it was Culture, Control and Chaos. And the culture being the sort of first word, because of course in organizations there is always culture. It's a sort of inevitable consequence of sort of people coming together. We don't have culture in machines because of course they are sort of technical systems, but nonetheless, of course, and as I'll sort of elaborate, technology is often sort of a major part of what goes on in organizations and alters the sort of the processes. So Tony Watson's account of talking to people and getting them to sort of to articulate what they thought was going on and why, and the impact, was really, really sort of seminal. And again, I would admit I have not gone back and read Malinowski's book, but I know enough of the sort of the influences that what he did was really, really important. So as you see, he was a British researcher. He was actually sort of Polish origin. And he sort of came to Britain in sort of the early part of the last century, so the early 1900s. And he wanted to go and sort of study the sort of the Malay New Guinea, the archipelagos, which of course, clearly known about. So it wasn't sort of as if this was a sort of a secret of society, which we shall talk about that also, because this can be a method of getting into secret societies, but nonetheless wanted to better understand what went on and why. Okay, I'll sort of go to the next slide if I will. So he wanted to sort of to do this, and of course you'll probably have seen this word, a naturalistic setting. So he didn't sort of, well, there were no sort of secondhand accounts. There was not sort of this literature or previously published literature. So he was the sort of a pioneer in this sense. But of course, what he realized he had to do was to sort of go and study these people in situ. And this required living amongst them for a number of years, which of course is a really major undertaking. It's not one I suggest that most people would want to do. And indeed, when I carried out my own research, it was on an interrupted basis now. So in that sense, I wasn't a true ethnographer, but nonetheless, I sort of went in and talked to people, over a couple of years, and garnered lots of data and tape recorded, which was really useful for me to deeply understand what was happening, certainly in regard to my study, and I'm sort of switching here, of quality management, which was being introduced and having various sort of impacts in the day-to-day lives of people. Malinowski, just to sort of come back to him, he wanted to see what these people were up to, what they did, how they operate. And I use that word in inverted commas because people, they do what they do. That's everyday life. Indeed, this is sort of another paper that I came across. Life is an everyday phenomenon. And indeed, that's the sense that suggests that sort of what people do is kind of, it's seen as mundane, but the sort of it's incumbent upon researchers to make better sense of it and to sort of provide these external accounts from the insiders. So you lived with the sort of the Troverland people from the years, observed them, talked to them quite clearly. I mean, I do stress this, he sort of had to do it in their own language. So of course, part of the sort of the research skill that you had to develop was to sort of to learn their language. So, but obviously it was much easier, in inverted commas, always a challenge, I do accept, by sort of going and living them rather than sort of learning it as an external sort of person. So that's another thing. So what he did, he derived information from personal observation. So he could write up this, but what he saw, but then he was able to ask people, well, what was actually going on? And of course, this is the clincher, that sometimes things you see are not all that they sort of purport to be. And by getting people to proffer their own accounts, you get a better understanding, a deeper understanding of what they're up to. And indeed, it's something my PhD sort of supervisor used to keep stressing. What do they think they're up to, and getting them to provide their own sort of accounts and explanations. And of course, what Malinowski was able to do, recorded verbatim. So I don't think he used a tape recording machine because it just wasn't so feasible, but he sort of took copious notes and just actually to add something really important. I think in this day and age, if at all possible, if you can get tape recordings, it does provide contemporaneous accounts, which you can then subsequently transcribe and use as sort of chunks of data when you sort of write up. And again, just hold that thought, I will come back to it. Interview data provides, interview transcripts can be a laborious process and brings a lot of sort of information, and you can't use it all quite clearly because it sometimes results in quite literally millions of words, and certainly many hundreds of thousands, and certainly in a doctoral piece of work, you're not going to sort of be able to put it all in. You can certainly put it in the appendices if you wish. It will provide a lot of printed material, but nonetheless, you use certain sort of aspects which sort of that you use in elaborating and deeply exploring the sort of first order concepts that you sort of may be interested, that you sort of elicit or sort of you identify from the sort of the research. So it comes back to, and this is an important word here, interpretation. Because ultimately, and I do accept that this is always the dilemma, you can't tell the whole story. All you can do is to sort of provide, and indeed, the editing process, and we hear about this in sort of every sort of walk of life, and particularly television programs. We don't see everything that goes on. All we see is the sort of, if you like, the edited highlights, and that's what the sort of any doctoral piece of work may be. Indeed, even in publication, you can't tell the whole story. Day by day, because that becomes a diary. Sometimes it has to be edited down just to sort of make it more interesting. So there you go. So that's what Malinowski was able to achieve. What it did do, and again, this is important, he was able to sort of provide the sort of a faithful account of these, and again, I'll read the words here because it's easier than me trying to sort of reconstitute them. The complex institution of the Kula ring, and became foundational to subsequent theories of reciprocity and exchange. So you're seeing this going on, that this is the way that sort of this society operated. But indeed, every society and every sort of culture and every subculture has their own sort of methods of doing things, which are sort of known to the insiders and quickly known to outsiders if they bother to look. But again, I come back to this point, until you sort of start deeply exploring, you never quite, you can't be sure. What you see may not be actually what's going on. And of course, what Malinowski did emphasize, and has been sort of taken up by many others who sort of used ethnography as a research approach, is the sort of the nature of human interactions in social institutions. And of course, as I say, every society and sub-society and subculture uses their unspoken rules and mores, if you like, of what they do and how people make sense. And of course, what it's led to is this notion of sort of fieldwork, getting out there, talking to people, observing, and doing the sort of the hard work. And of course, I do also emphasize that it requires hard work. as opposed to sort of developing a questionnaire which you send to, I don't know, as many participants as you hope you think are going to answer, and then getting a sort of statistical sample of the sort of the whole population. But your population becomes, by virtue, a much smaller sort of set, because of course it's the people in the organization, or maybe the bits of the organization that you're interested in particular phenomenon, which are sort of germane to sort of the research project that you're carrying out, or the research question. So of course there is obviously a degree of self-selection, and that may be something, if you use such an approach, you'll have to justify in your viva, and certainly you probably have to, you should really justify in the sort of the research methods chapter, you know, why did you talk to these people and not others? So why did you go to this organization and not another organization? So these are all sort of things which will sort of work their way out. But ultimately, you and maybe your supervisory team will be the only people in the best position to judge what you can do and what you can't do, and where you can gain access. So of course, that's the other thing. Access is all important. Now, again, just to add another aspect to that, can you do an ethnography in your own organization? Yeah, I mean, it's more challenging. I think that the difficulty is you're part of the system, so you'd have to find a way, and it can become a personal ethnography, which, you know, and there are publications on personal ethnography. I like the idea, and you know, for the sake of today's presentation, let's talk about going into other organisations, because of course what that does present the challenge of doing is A, access, B, understanding, and, you know, talking the language and maintain the relationships. And then also the sort of the sense making that you develop, because of course, if you've already been there, you kind of know what's going on. You have your own sort of baggage, which is a result of being in amongst those participants. But if you're entering that situation for the first time, then clearly you're seeing it as a sort of a newcomer. Okay, and you know, finally, to provide justification for not just studying and observing people, but in facilitating the ability to provide accounts of phenomena affecting them, or in which they are sort of actively involved in their own words. And again, yeah, I've used this expression before: what do they think is going on and why? I think that is at the heart of what the ethnography and organizational ethnography is about. And just to sort of finish off this little bit, the sort of the history, this is Malinowski in his own words: I consider only say that only such as ethnographic sources are of unquestionable scientific value. I actually would take issue with scientific, because of course, but I'm not going to get bogged down in that. You know, what is science? And I think this is not really science. It's an alternative, which is just as valuable, if not more so, for providing the accounts. But anyway, that's me sort of agonizing, in which we can clearly draw the line between, on the one hand, the results of direct observations and of native statements and interpretations, and on the other hand, the inferences of the author based on his, it should be, and her, common sense and psychological sort of insights. So there you go. That's Malinowski, sort of, which, as I say, his book, the Argonauts, was published, you know, hundreds of years ago this year, so not a century ago. Okay, a lot of what I'm going to say now has kind of been covered, but I'm obviously doing it in sort of much more theoretical way, perhaps. So ethnography is a naturalistic and deliberately of real people or activities operating their normal, naturalistic environment. Rejects notions of experiments or simulated settings involving artificial worlds of control events. So, and again, that brings me back to sort of my difficulties. I could not sort of use a hypothetical deductive approach, because I could not sort of create the causality. There were things going on, there were people doing what they did, they were making sense of the thing that was being done to them, which is the introduction of quality management systems. But could I sort of say that sort of profits were going up, productivity was improving, and all the sort of the other sort of grand claims that were made by, as I say, the sort of the practitioner-orientated authors, many of whom were consultants. They had a sort of a vested interest in propagating this thing, but I couldn't say one thing was leading to another. So I had to find a sort of new approach, which was, well, in my case, I used an interpretive approach, but it has a lot of resonance with what we're talking about here in terms of ethnography. Okay, I'm going to sort of refer now. It's obviously not that contemporary, but sort of I think 70 years on from sort of the publication of sort of Malinowski's book, Clifford Geertz, which is the sort of the idea of thick description. The idea of this is that it's the sort of the in fact, if I come to the sort of last point, the presentation of rich data. And it's the whole idea that if you're going to examine people and what they do in cultures and subcultures, you then have to sort of to really examine carefully what people are saying and derive meaning. What are people up to? And again, you see a sort of definition there, a set of culturally constructed and historically specific guides, frames, and models for human feeling, intention, and action. And again, and the point, to sort of to simplify that, is that people don't do things mindlessly. We hear mindless violence, for instance, but by and large, people normally, unless they're under the influence of drugs or alcohol or other such stimulants, they do things in a sort of rational way. People don't set out to be sort of to do things badly in organisation, and that's sometimes what happens. But there are a whole set of circumstances and sort of influences which create that. And what you often find once you start to sort of to look beneath the surface, is people are doing things not because of the way that they think it should be done. It's despite, not because of the good intentions. Indeed, quite often what they may sort of say is that they're doing things in a sort of bad way because, of course, or a poor way, or sort of inefficient way, quite precisely because of the sort of the system. And indeed, part of my study of quality management involved the sort of the examination of the sort of the philosophy of Dr. W. Edwards Deming, who was one of the major quality gurus. And if you've never heard that name before, your homework is to go and sort of just look it up, because you'll be fascinated by what he did. And he also sort of said this, that you create really good systems to enable people, not to disable them. And he said that sort of quite often a lot of the problems, the vast majority of problems, are down to management controls and sort of what they set the agenda. In fact, just to add to that, that he created the sort of the philosophy of quality management in Japan, where you give workers much greater autonomy to control their own processes, because they're in the sort of the sharp end. They know what's important, they know how things work on the ground. Anyway, I don't want to get too bogged down. So thick description, specific to time and place. It's about sort of cultural relativism. Opposed to power and politics, culture is not power, something which social events, behaviours, institution or process can be causally attributed. It is a context, something which they can be intelligibly, that is, thickly described. Okay, so as opposed to sort of thin descriptions, which of course, as opposed to thin description, which is simply very sort of knockabout sentences, it's really about exploring deep and meaningful understanding through the sort of explanations proffered by the sort of the individuals. Okay, and the characteristics of thick description: hermeneutics, the interpretation of language, whether it's written or spoken. Indeed, and that can, when you're doing this, a lot of what happens in organisations is guided by the policy manuals and sort of the rules and procedures, whatever else that people do. And certainly that was very important in terms of what I was doing in quality management, which was about looking at sort of procedure manuals that were being introduced to govern people's behaviour. And again, just to add one of my conclusions that I quickly discovered, perhaps with no great surprise, if procedure manuals are written by people who don't carry out processes, they're often badly written and don't fully reflect what goes on. And it makes a bad situation worse, in the sense that so people do things badly consistently. And that's not what you want. You want them to do good things consistently, because of course that's what they believe to be the right way of doing things. And it's about sort of the worker autonomy, or empowerment as it's used to be called, and probably still is. Semiotics, the sort of the study how meaning is created, because of course, when we have a conversation, you don't have to keep sort of consulting. Well, okay, except if you're sort of talking something in a different language, you may need a sort of an interpretation. Or the sort of the translation. But when we're having discussions with friends and family, we talk about things and we know what people are trying to say, and of course if we don't, we get them to sort of to say, well, what do you mean? And we get them to unpack it. And that's what is at the heart of ethnography, getting sort of people to sort of, as you summarize in the next bullet point, we create our own construction of what people say. A bit like, if I was to say, oh, it's hot in here today, it's not just for anybody's reference. It's probably about sort of 20 degrees, which is, it's pleasant but not hot, and it's not cold. But hot to me can mean it's 30 degrees. But for someone, hot could be even greater than that. There is a degree of subjectivity that we've got to sort of bear in mind. Different things mean different things to different people, so we've got to sort of to mediate our way through these conversations. So there is a lot of skill in doing this. And we've got to be careful. Sort of, there are things that we call taken for granted assumptions, but sometimes they need sort of a bit of unpacking. And dare I say, in organisations, organizations can run informally, and indeed the best organization are those where there's a degree of commitment, as opposed to organizations which will run highly sort of formally, which of course is about sort of rules and procedures. But anybody who has ever looked at organizations will realize that sort of the more you institute rules, the more people find ways of sort of not breaking them so much, as although that may happen, but they find ways of sort of getting around them. There's a lot of sort of literature which shows exactly how this happens. So managers got to be careful. They often think they're in control, but of course the fact is, though, as soon as managers turn their backs, people are sort of they're sticking their fingers up and doing what they think works best. But again, you know, that's a sort of an over glorious simplification. And what you're trying to do in any organization is have people who are really strongly committed. And this is why you know, things like, you know, religions and charities and sort of things which people are deeply sort of committed to from their own personal value system work best, because you don't have to tell people what to do. You don't have to sort of to get them to sort of to turn up in the morning. They do it because they are truly committed, as opposed to work-based organizations where, you know, you have to have people sort of turn up at a certain time and people going out at a certain time, and, you know, they're taking their lunch breaks and all that sort of thing and wearing uniforms, because of course it becomes a bit like a sort of a you know, boarding school or a prison or whatever it might be. And COVID, dare I say it, has demonstrated that, you know, people can work at home, and it's given a real boost to it. And I think that the big problem with a lot of organizations has been managers don't trust people to work at home because they think they'll be in the garden. And maybe they will be, but you know, the point is, if you want, you know, whatever work you want, the work package, and they do it, you know, in the morning, the afternoon, the evening, and and it works well, does it matter? So you can get more out of people by working with them, not against them. Okay, analysis is based on guessing at meanings, assessing at the guesses, and drawing explanatory conclusions for the better guesses. But of course, it's the sort of the iterative sort of cycle of you know, constantly going through and sort of looking and trying to develop better and deeper understanding. Theory is achieved on accepting that a general theory of cultural interpretation is not possible, but a cultural theory may be derived. And again, we'll come back to that. But the point being that, as I say, it's also about sort of trying to be condescending and believing that you can make sense of all these things. You have to sort of keep sort of probing and probing and probing until you get the sort of the best possible sort of and fullest explanation, which faithfully sort of represents what goes on and why from the perspective of the people involved. Okay, this is important, and this comes back to sort of the whole thing about sort of research philosophy. Generalization is not possible across cases, but within cases. So of course, quite clearly what goes on in an organization or even in a sub element of that organization and department, you know, it may be true there. I'd even answer that. It may be true at the time you spoke to these people, and it may alter. Because of course, the one thing I always emphasize, or used to emphasize to students, is that people are not machines, that they at the sort of the very heart of sort of human action and interaction is sort of irrationality. Yeah, we all do things most of the time with a rational intent, but sometimes we, you know, wake up and we just have a bad mood. We, you know, hands up those who've never sort of done this. You do things and you think, why did I do that? And of course, part of that sort of difficulty is that sort of our sort of opinions and attitudes and our sort of stances, they vary depending upon the whole sort of set of sort of influences that we're subject to in our personal lives, and sort of the things that sort of are brought to bear, yeah, particularly in terms of sort of personal relationships at home. That has a bearing upon what we do at work. And you know, in work organizations, of course, as we know, you know, that people are great because of course they're creative sort of creatures, but of course they bring with them this all the sort of the human emotions, hence why a lot of organizations now work through machines and algorithms, because of course they don't have this as of yet. But you know, we've all seen Terminator, and if you haven't, maybe you will do at some point. Maybe the machines will sort of start to develop emotions. Okay, prediction is eschewed, but anticipation is possible. So the point is that you're not about in the sort of the game of sort of you know, deriving, you know, definitive sort of conclusions, which will sort of, you know, the scientific theory that, you know, when I press the sort of light bulb on or press the sort of switch, the light bulb will come on, because that's not the sort of the way organizations tend to react. Things may happen, but they may not happen. You have to sort of be very careful about that, but we can come back to that later. Okay, I'm going to whiz through a lot of this because of course it kind of says a lot of the same sort of things, but it's quite useful. No commonly agreed definition, but it can be sort of primary concerned, or is primarily concerned with organization and their processes of organizing. So it's about people, what they do, and how they sort of they interact with one another to create whatever the sort of desired objective is at the end. And as I've alluded to a couple of moments ago, organizations can have very specific sort of purposes, business organizations, or they can have very fluid and sort of organic sort of things, which is merely the sort of the thing about coming together and sort of the creating a sort of a club, as it were, or sort of a society in which you sort of you just enjoy each other's as I say, interactions. So I'll leave it for you to sort of work that one out. But again, there's a wide range of definitions of organisations. Aims to achieve intimate knowledge of the situated actors and objects, and of course, they're the people who exist in these organisations, and without whom the organisation would have no being, as it were. And indeed, as I keep stressing, without people, something that happens, it's a machine. It's a technical system. But of course, it doesn't have a culture, therefore it's not truly an organization. Okay, organizational ethnography are regarded as a particular type of social practice, and again, kind of reinforce what's already been said, focused on the study and representation of culture. Dare I say it, let me just draw your attention to Van Manen, another of the sort of the wonderful authors I came across. He did lots of study in the sort of the 70s and 80s in sort of New York, really seminal sociologist who's really contributed to sort of the work of organizational ethnography. And indeed, you see Watson, who I've already referred to, a distinctive type of research and a methodology rather than method and involved the selection. And this is important, a range of techniques, which includes selection and sampling, participant observation, interviewing, questionnaires, existing documented information, which is the hermeneutics, as well as the use of recording devices and, as Fetterman sort of said, notes. So, once you start doing this, you're constantly sort of writing up and making sense and rewriting and evolving. And indeed, just before we had the introduction, or before I started, I was talking to a student who sort of talked about sort of, you may wish to sort of say this isn't strictly correct, but, having to really go back and start again, or sort of junking it. And that's often the sort of thing, what you think you're going to find is not often what happens. And that's why I often believe, and this is an important piece of advice, if you get out into the field and start collecting data almost before you started reading, and I know it doesn't quite work like that, but you're reading, collecting data, the more you understand about things in practice, the better able you are to sort of to interrogate the sort of the relevance or not of the things that's in the literature. And certainly one of the big takeaways of my own PhD is, I would safely say that a lot of what I read was not junk, but it was, pretty much, it didn't represent, or had no sort of bearing, representation, or sort of, relevance to sort of the world of the sort of the managers I was looking at, mainly because, of course, it was pretty simplistic, and, there was lots of predictions, none of which I could sort of see was actually happening. Things were happening, but for a whole range of other reasons. So what it makes you better able to do is to sort of be a better scholar practitioner, which is very much the sort of the world of professional doctorates. And those of you who've done that will sort of know that sort of word, scholar practitioner. Anyway, so, I've gone to includes attention to what may seem as banal and mundane features of organisation realities. Because again, a lot of what people do every day is just what they do, and they often do it in a relatively unthinking way. But by helping them to sort of to, as I say, surface their own understanding and unpack their own emotions, it kind of is therapeutic for them. And indeed, a number of people I sort of spoke to said how much they enjoyed being able to talk about the things that sort of nobody ever bothered talking to them about. Things were done to them and not with them, as it were. Okay, I'm just making sure I've not jumped. Yeah. Okay, I think that's right. Okay. Organizational ethnography requires not only fieldwork but headwork and text work. So that kind of draws upon what I've just been saying. So it's a combination. It's a sort of simultaneous, reading, rereading, being out in the field, understanding, and drawing the sort of the comparison between, because of course the text is supposed to be where you get the theory, or the sort of the pre-existing sort of knowledge, and the sort of the field work is where you sort of understand how things are sort of working on a day-to-day basis, and you can compare and contrast and make better understanding. In particular, understandings held by others, meaning about work, careers, at the core of ethnographic practice, which is Van Manen again. He also entails subjecting oneself to at least part of life situation of others, which of course is the whole point of being in the naturalistic setting, and spending, and it's my case, I used to, as much as I could, because it's a part-time piece of work, sometimes 2, 3, 4 days, if I could, just being with these people and helping them out and just talking to them and working out the sort of the issues that they were having to sort of to grapple with on a day-to-day basis. Conscious of time, the immersion in close observation of life, okay, so, and it requires careful attention to the everyday interaction situations and occurrences, which of course is back to Malinowski and everyone else who's ever used this approach. You've really got to be there and see it as it happens day in, day out. So you can't do ethnography just for an hour on a Friday afternoon. It doesn't work like that. You have to sort of spend quality time, as it might be said. Nayland warns ethnographic preoccupation with culture can sometimes mistakenly be understood as being confined to people, not objects or technology. And although ethnographic research also concerns that, and the point, that's from sort of Jablonski. And of course, the thing is, though, in my case, it was quality management systems, which are not so much technology, but of course, the sort of what was the technology, I suppose these days would be done by sort of computer systems, everything would be online. And of course, there's lots of studies being done into sort of to online working and the use of computers and so on and so forth. And indeed, the whole of the Industrial Revolution was about sort of the impact that technology had on the way in people and societies operate. But hey, that's another thing. What I would sort of say is the introduction of policy manuals, which hitherto did not exist. It disturbed the sort of the fine balance between what went on and people's resistance to change. And indeed, you might hear this, of course, as I said, management of change is a very difficult process and should be sort of approached with great care. And indeed, as I say, once you get in and see what's going on, you can then better sort of refine the introduction of what it is that you're doing in such a way as to, so as I say, keep emphasizing working with the sort of the participants and not just treat them as a sort of unthinking beings, which is often sort of the way of things. And indeed, anybody who's ever sort of studied the sort of Hawthorne experiment, I'll leave that just hanging in the air. But that was a great ethnographic study. It was the sort of the introduction of new lighting systems to sort of in the Hawthorne plant in 1930s Chicago. But yeah, I can come back to that. Okay, what should you do? Well, okay, it's about the truthful accounts, the faithful accounts, as is often said, it's about people's experiences. You select the groups which are germane to sort of the issue that you're interested in. So clearly people who are sort of working with or because of, who are affected by the thing that you're interested in. So of course that will sort of obviously indicate the sort of the nature of the organization that you want to get into, where you think this phenomenon or the phenomena that you're interested in is occurring. So as I say, and quite often it comes down to who will allow you access and who won't. And quite clearly, if you don't get access, it's kind of not quite game over. I'll come back to that in a minute, but certainly if you're going to do the research covertly, they won't give you access, then that the gatekeepers have closed the gate. So but there are other methods in, but there are ethical issues attached to that. Attention to context in terms of the organizational ethnography, as practice can be seen to be inherently contextually and difficult to understand without taking into account interactions, action emerging in the flux of organizational activity. So that's a long way of saying that you've got to get in there, you've got to immerse yourself, you've got to find out and see what these people are up to, and then get them to sort of profile their accounts and see if it sort of aligns with what you thought was happening. And indeed, don't be surprised if there is something of a mismatch. And so finally, as far as this slide goes, strives to deeply immerse research in the social practice and processes rather than rarefied states, and therefore takes into consideration everything that occurs. Indeed, I talked about sort of the banal and mundane, or I'm just using different words this time, trivial or common. The things that people sort of do on a day-to-day basis, that they've just always done them. And certainly in my research, I come across things that people did them, and because that's the way it's always been done. And quite often, what you're able to do by sort of exploring this is say, well, do you really need to do it? Indeed, that's part of the sort of the nature of organizational improvement, thinking through things that can be done better by dispensing with the sort of the non-value-adding activities. But you've got to do this in close consultation with the people carrying out the activities and find out, and you've got to get them to understand why they're non-value adding and get them to accept that through their own processes rather than imposing on it, because of course that's a real sort of no-no if you try and do things without sort of consultation. Okay, we get into sort of the aspect of sort of what you do, and it really comes into, well, firstly, you've got to be clear about what it is you're trying to understand. And dare I say it, I think where this works best, if I may sort of say, if you've got a clear sense of sort of the questions that you want to answer, and you've got a, dare I say, hypothesis, and you can sort of get the sort of the data which objectively will sort of show one way or another, that's perfectly fine. And, you know, I'd applaud people if they can do that. But my impression and my experience of the majority of students I've ever worked with is that it's not like that. Certainly not in the sort of world of sort of social sciences and management business. It's more sort of fluid. And where this works well is where you've got a kind of a hunch about things, so that you've narrowed down to some sort of issue, but you're not quite sure what it is that you really want to find out. So to some extent, it's finding out what you can find out. And this allows you that flexibility to sort of to continue to adapt what you're up to, and insofar as to then refine the questions based upon what's going on and how. What it does mean, I sort of use this expression later on, it's Silverman who sort of talks about reconstructing logic. Yeah, for sure. You know, what you're doing is you then have to work backwards. You might have to sort of completely sort of rewrite the sort of the theory that you thought that you're going to have, if you'd done it in the kind of the logical sort of order of reading the literature, then developing the questions, then collecting the data. This is kind of the other way around. It's about sort of going out and developing the questions on the basis of what's occurring, and at the same sort of time, that then constantly adapting sort of the research objectives, questions, whatever it is, and eventually, of course, reconstitute it into a sort of finished piece of work, which has got the sort of the logical sort of structure that a PhD, or indeed any sort of publication for that matter, should have. So it's about gaining access to negotiation. It should be overt. I think I might have sort of misused that word. So when I said you normally do it overtly, which of course is you gain access, everyone knows what you're up to, and that's perfectly fine, provided, of course, that sort of, there aren't any difficulties. I do actually sort of raise this subsequently. One of the sort of problems is that people change their practice because they feel they're being observed. My experience is that sort of most people don't work like that. Once you're in and you get to know people, they just can do what they do. Unless, of course, you know, you're observing nefarious activities or illegal activities, in which case then I don't think you're going to get access to it. And just to add, one of the most brilliant accounts I ever came across was down in Wolf's. It was a chapter, or it was a series of chapters called Insider Research by Schoeffer and Stebbins, and he talked about sort of studying a motorcycle gang, and you know what they were involved in a lot of illegal activities. And you don't just apply to them and join them. You have to sort of to go through a whole initiation process. So he had to do it covertly. So he had to join and engage in some of the activities. And then he had to break the sort of the code of silence, which of course in the chapter he talks about. There were difficulties associated with that, because normally once you do that, you're under sentence of death. It's a bit like the sort of the mafia, but he successfully negotiated all that. But what I would sort of say is that covert is often seen as really problematic, and there's ethical issues about sort of reporting conversations that sort of people sort of didn't know they were on the record. So I think you have to sort of to make people, and you know, particularly in the age in which we live in, people have to be sort of absolutely clear about what your purpose is, and they can agree to sort of collaborate and be involved, or they can say no. That you know, that's perfectly their choice. You have no say in it. All you can do is ask politely and hope for the best. Okay, I don't think I need to say much more about data collection. Well, at the present, I mean, there's lots more I could say, but yeah, it's all kind of summarized. It's about sort of the hard slog of sort of talking to people, recording conversations, if at all possible, write loads of notes, observing what goes on, and by and large trying to sort of to focus in on the sort of, as I call them, the first order issues, the things which you think are really significant and crucial to whatever phenomenon that you're interested in. You know, just again to say, in my use of sort of quality management, or my study of quality management rather, you know, I was interested, most particularly what the PhD eventually became, was the sort of in the 12 organizations I've studied, so it was much more widespread than would normally be the case. I focused on the people who were given responsibility for introducing it, and you know, lo and behold, you know, there were very few books written to sort of guide these people. They told them what it was and what you're supposed to, you know, from a very theoretical point of view, but they didn't tell them about how you do it, and the sort of the hurdles and the challenges and the resistance that you're going to meet, all of which are in a sort of book which I wrote about 20 odd years ago, which I'm happy to talk about later on if people wish. As you probably appreciate, this requires time, patience, and tolerance, but by those being observed and or interviewed, as well as yourself, you've got to be in for a long slog on this one. So it's not something you're going to get done in sort of a couple of weeks or a couple of months. You really sort of got to dedicate probably a sort of certainly if you're a full-time student, maybe a year of your sort of study, and if you're a part-time student, a couple of years, which is what I did. Constant analysis and refinement, so re-evaluating what it is you're up to and think about the questions, rethinking. So it's a work in progress. It's never complete until it's complete, as it were. And allies that, the writing and refinement of ideas it is, as I say, constantly evolving with the objective of a faithful account of what it is that you're interested with respect to the particular phenomena. And again, as I've said already, you can't report everything. There's normally a word limit in the sort of piece of work you're doing, even for a sort of publication. You have to to edit down to the sort of things which are really sort of critical and important. And I'm speaking in sort of very general terms. I can't sort of make that decision, or I can't say how to do that, but you will decide that on the basis of what you know from talking to people out there in the field. Okay, so the analysis of data, constant reevaluation of relevance. Seeking to identify patterns, what's going on and why, and what's really sort of critical to sort of success or failure, as it may be. Surfacing phenomena through cultural perspectives, i.e. what people sort of talk about, what they sort of see as being absolutely sort of important to their day-to-day lives. Using the principles of thick description. Classification of parameters, the ethic, which is the external observation, which is what you do through the EMIC, the internal sort of accounts, explanations, and descriptions. And as the hermeneutics, to sort of including the relevant supporting documents, manuals, rulebooks, guidebooks, anything that sort of people sort of are, it's crucial, or at least it's part of their world, as it were, including the sort of the layout of the sort of the organization, or the sort of the hierarchy, or the sort of the particularly uniforms that people wear, or whatever it might be. Everything has has an importance. It's not just done for fun, but there will always be a reason, and your job is to sort of to examine and explore and clarify what these reasons are. Again, this is a fairly straightforward slide. Active or passive presence, an active role, trying to fully integrate, carry out the tasks. So you may then sort of just become part of the work team, either normally explicitly. Very rarely it'll be done without sort of the explicit knowledge of the people, overtly, and that's like covertly. Let me get the right, but so normally it's overt insofar as that people know what you're up to. So active participation may encourage the group to feel more comfortable with the ethnographer's presence, but it runs the risk of disrupting the regular functioning of the sort of community, in the sense that you become part of the event, where you become an event in yourself, and people sort of modify their behavior and what they tell you because they think you're one of the sort of the management spies or snitches or whatever it might be. But by and large, I've never come across that. So I know some people sort of do find sort of difficulties. But okay, it's something which needs careful sort of managing, and of course, if the sort of the access is negotiated properly, it shouldn't be a problem. Passive role is one which the ethnographer stands back, which to some extent, is a lot of what I did. You basically you're there and you're just seen as somebody who's doing research, and sort of you're not involved in the community's activities or the sort of the social situation. But obviously the passive observation requires more space for careful observation and note-taking. But the group may behave naturally to feel that they're being observed by an outsider. Yeah, it's a possibility, but one which I wouldn't worry too greatly about. I think most people just get on with what they're up to, because once they learn to trust you, and that's the thing, you see. Of course, quite clearly, if you report every conversation back, then don't expect them to sort of to open up quite as much in the future if they find out that's what's going on. Okay, writing up. Okay, I'm coming to the end, so you're pleased to know. So it's the hardest part of the research process. Well, writing any research, regardless of however you do it. But of course, this is really difficult because you will be overwhelmed by a lot of data. But hopefully, by sort of constantly reconsidering what is or is not important, or is more important than other things, then you might sort of be able to sort of to self-edit as the sort of the process goes along, so you don't leave this all to the end. But nonetheless, if you do lots of hundreds of hours of interview and you transcribe it, don't be surprised that you end up with sort of literally many hundreds of thousands, if not millions of words, which you've then got to sort of to make sense of. So and that can be a really arduous process. So be careful about that. And the other thing is, if you do record interviews, remember it can be a time-consuming process. And I had a guidance that 1 hour of interview, it takes about 8 hours to transcribe. I know people can get it done quicker, and some people actually sort of they get others to do it for them professionally. And that's fine. But I also think that sort of by listening to the tapes, if you, of course, you can get people to sort of go on record, it's a really valuable process, because you then pick up things which in the sort of the normal course of a conversation, things may not have seen a significance when you sort of listen back to the tapes, and you sort of suddenly discover things or see something that wasn't apparent at that time. As I mentioned this earlier on, you may, as a result of sort of the data collection process, redefine where you start, redefine the sort of the literature and the sort of the theoretical perspectives that you think are important, on the basis that the things you maybe thought important at the sort of the outset, yeah, they're not what people talk about. So that you can leave it there, but you'd be better off to talk about the theoretical perspectives, because of course every sort of piece of research has to have a sort of theory chapter which has direct relevance to sort of the phenomena that you're interested in. And of course, yeah, that introduced this point. As I say, this is, as I say, the chicken and the egg. Normally the sort of the chicken is the theory and the egg is the sort of the data. But in this case, the sort of you use the sort of the data to sort of tell you what, where to find the chicken, if you were, or to sort of to identify better which chickens are sort of more relevant than others, if that's not a bit of a mixture of metaphors. But as I say, the data becomes, it's started, or the data collection process can be started really early on, and it will help you to sort of to clarify the literature, which may sort of not be particularly specific. And that certainly was the case in me. I sort of found that I could go back and reevaluate the sort of literature with much greater confidence than I would have done without sort of collecting data. Okay, may take many drafts to ensure a complete picture, and indeed, as those of you who sort of been involved in writing will sort of attest, getting the sort of the final piece of work is only sort of, it's inevitably snapshots, and it's the sort of the best representation that you can provide of the sort of the research that you've carried out, and it tells the sort of the fullest possible picture. And of course, this is why you may then have to dispense with a lot of the sort of the things that you thought were interesting. But of course, it goes all over the place. So, but you start to narrow down the focus. So you kind of getting to the sort of point at which, of course, a hypothesis is about, which of course is very narrowly defined, because of course that's about sort of collecting data, which is absolutely relevant. Okay, finally, 2 slides to go. This probably it kind of reinforces everything we said already. It's about in-depth appreciation of culture through your interpretation of what people tell you and how you sort of get them to sort of unpack meaning. It allows the voices to emerge, which of course you wouldn't do otherwise. But certainly if you used a questionnaire approach, even with the sort of the open-ended questions, people might, that's time consuming, and they'll tell you something, but they won't tell you as much as if you sort of have a conversation with them. So, 10 minutes with somebody is worth, in my opinion, 100 questionnaires, but people might argue about that. Influencing and creating understanding amongst outsiders, and of course that's the whole point. Whether you sort of use this to sort of to pass your PhD or your DBA or whatever doctoral piece of work you do, or you subsequently write up in the way that Malinowski and Watson and Van Manen and many other ethnographers have done. It gives us, or Daniel J. Wolfe, I learned more about motorcycle gangs than I ever sort of knew before. Because of course we get to, we see beyond the sort of the facade or the outside, and indeed many organisations, it's this whole sort of thing in culture. You may have sort of seen the representation of it's like a tree. We see the outward symbols, which is what we call it, the sort of the thing that God, I'm losing my sort of thread on this one. The tree obviously has the leaves and the branches, and so the trunk, that's the word, well, the trunk. But no tree exists without roots, and the roots is the sort of the more implied aspects, and the sort of the taking for granted knowledge that people sort of within the organisation know of. But of course, it's hidden to outsiders because, of course, we don't see it because it's not on show. And organisations like to sort of to have an outward display of the things they want us to see, and not the internal mechanism. So, as I say, what we are able to do through this is to sort of to shed light on that. Okay, I'm coming at 2 o'clock, and I think it's almost time to finish. But indeed, the dilemmas that you must confront, it is time consuming. No 2 ways about that. But then that's the nature of doctoral research. If you can find a quick way of doing it, then let me know, because I'll be very interested. Potential of the researcher to alter the natural way of culture behaves, meaning by their presence. Yeah, and this is why I grudgingly admit a covert approach may be considered, but I still think the sort of any piece of work that tries to do this, it will sort of immediately come up against the sort of the problems of the ethics committee, and that they will have a lot of questions about what you're doing and how you're doing it, particularly if there are dangers to the participants. There may also be dangers to sort of the researcher. The generalizing of findings is not objective, or it's not the objective, rather. It's not hypothetical deductive research, so it's not about proving and disproving. It's merely about sort of elaborating and shining a light into sort of places where the light doesn't normally sort of reach. As somebody once said to me, it's like lifting up stones and seeing what's underneath. There may be lots of creepy crawlies, but as we know, creepy crawlies are good for cultivating the soil, and adding to sort of the general sort of way in which we sort of all exist as participants in this wonderful planet. Not appropriate for analysing complex problems in which cause-effect relationships are external to the place of study or place and time of study. So yeah, in effect, what that's saying is that if you may wish to study complex problems, but it's not, as I sort of said right at the outset, like my sort of piece of work. I'm not trying to prove or disprove. You're just trying to sort of better understand what's going on and why. And indeed, of course, the difficulty of reconciling constructive engagement with critical reflection. So that there are, it's a challenge, and it's not one which is insurmountable. But sort of, you've got to sort of constantly sort of reevaluate what your central role in all of this is. And indeed, there is a sort of, I'll leave this point as the sort of last one. You are very much part of the research process, even though, of course, it's about the sort of participants. It's your interpretation, so you've got to be sort of careful about that one. And indeed, in any piece of work, and certainly any doctoral student, they will normally sort of have a critical reflection chapter, whereby, of course, they sort of have to sort of articulate how they did everything they did, and how they sort of made sense, and sort of the meanings that they attach, because ultimately it's your piece of work that's being examined, albeit you're using their views. And at that point, I will. I'll perhaps I'll sort of invite Anna to come in so she can sort of elaborate on this, because this is about the sort of the advanced courses. Hello, Anna.
Yes, sure. We exactly have a number of advanced courses that you can also use to progress mainly on your journey during your thesis. The writing up and structuring your thesis is one of them. We also recently introduced the clubs, so the journey clubs. So you have 6 clubs that exactly will take you from the proposal to the publishing. So we invite you exactly to join one that is relevant for the stage that you are in. And as usual, like our courses are available as a self-study format, so you can go through all the contents. And then if you need, obviously, further support, we are happy to come in, basically. So, Stephen, I think that's briefly exactly, as we are already, like a bit sharper on time.
Okay, I'm stopping the share. So we've got
before exactly I switch off the recording, perhaps.
Okay.
Remember, we had 2 questions at the forum of this webinar. I have no idea if you had the chance of looking at them.
No, I was concentrating on the slide. So if I go to the,
I can also read them out to you. It's not a problem.
It's in the chat. I didn't see anything in chat.
No. It's the forum of the webinar itself.
Oh, the forum. Okay, no, I haven't looked at that. So
we have, how do we assess that our research topic is suitable for ethnographic study? And what is the difference between ethnographic research, case study, and action research?
Right, I'm just trying to think about the sort of the questions as they came. Okay, hopefully it came out in the sort of description. Ethnographic research is about sort of going into, it's a bit like going on holiday. One of the things about going on holiday is that you sort of experience different cultures, different languages, and so in a kind of crude way, that's what this is. It's seeing the phenomena in organizations where it's being used, but you go in as the outsider, which then introduces the question, which I did address, can you do ethnographic research in your own organization? It's got different challenges because, of course, you're part of the situation. So that is different again, which has relevance to sort of the other question that you asked. And in fact, yeah, I'll get you to elaborate, but action research, that's normally done within your organization, although you could do a piece of ethnographic work which is based upon action research in that organization. That would certainly be perfectly feasible, whereby you took the problem, quite clearly you'd have to sort of to negotiate access to the organization, or indeed your own organization if you wish, and you plant the sort of the seed, as it were, and then you watch what happens when it sort of grows up, or at least perhaps strain that metaphor a little bit, but you implement the whatever it might be, the solution, or the sort of the suggested sort of alteration to sort of to day-to-day practice, and then you observe what happens and talk to people about what's happening, what's occurring in their lives, and how they're making sense of what goes on. So what were the other two? So the action research?
It was, give me a second, action research and case study.
Well, yeah, but a case study is simply where you sort of go in and, I think ethnographic research lends itself to a sort of case study. But again, it depends what you mean by a case study. But a case study is normally where you go in and you sort of do the sort of the very deep research of the sort which I've entirely been particularly, just to sort of say that these things are not sort of hermetically sealed, and it's a kind of solution A or solution B. They kind of straddle, and I think you could sort of use this. And indeed, in one of the slides early on, it lists a range of sort of things, all of which are sort of part of the panoply of qualitative approaches. And I think that sort of you use whatever techniques you wish to, because the only objective that you have, in simple terms, is getting hold of data, and the data is about the sort of the people that do things, and you obviously want to observe them. More particularly, you want them to get them to give their explanations on or off the record. So whatever techniques you use to sort of to do that, it really doesn't matter, because ultimately it's about sort of being able to sort of to, with regard to or respect to whatever phenomenon that you're interested in, being able to show its practical relevance and the way it plays out on a day-to-day basis. So I'm very relaxed about that, and I wouldn't get hung up on definitions, because as I indicated, it's not me that's saying this, there is no agreed definition. It's just simply the better understanding of the participants, most particularly achieved through sort of research approaches, techniques, methods, whatever words you care to use, in their naturalistic setting, what they do on a day-to-day basis. Any more questions?
No, those were the.
I'm sorry. In fact, I remember. Yes, I did. I considered them, and hopefully that they were elaborated in the sort of the research which I carried out. But again, I really stress, if you're interested in this, it's fascinating, and indeed that there is an aspect of this which is about what's called storytelling. But that's what goes on in organization. People are constantly telling stories. And indeed, I don't know if anyone's ever worked in an organization where there's a rule of silence, which I know it depends on particular circumstances. And of course, open plan offices, that they introduce certain difficulties because, of course, people, if you've got this hubbub, it makes life difficult. The point I'm making quite precisely is that what brings about organizations, and of course, what most people who work in an organizational setting have missed most during COVID, because of working at home, is the sort of the ability to chat to the person on the next desk or across the office. And I know that there's Teams and Zooms and whatever else, but it's not quite the same as being in the room with people, and that's the whole aspect. Is that the storytelling is really important. It's a natural part of our sort of our societal development and our sub-societal or subcultural development in organizations. Who did what, and hero worship, and all the sort of things that go on in the study of culture, and it has a sort of really powerful effect in inducing people into the belief system. And quite, this is what happens. This is what, people who don't believe in what goes on in the organization, they clash, and ultimately they either get jettisoned by being sacked or whatever, or they leave because they don't get on with it. But as I say, we have really, I'm trying to get a word, not clever, but that there are really sort of subliminal ways of, as I say, introducing the right people that fit, and then sort of mold them in such a way as that so they go along with whatever goes on. And this is why organization, the informal aspects of organizations are far more powerful than anything that management can ever do by sort of their imposition of sort of formalistic sort of processes.
And I think one of the main key takeaways that I have from today's webinar is that you are passionate about ethnography. So I think
does that come
I
across?
will end up, before I switch the recording, is exactly with the invitation to join the research planning or the research execution clubs, because exactly Stephen is the host, and I'm sure you have very deep and great conversations about it. And with this, I'm switching the recording off. That's if there is a special question, exactly anyone can ask.
Okay,